place names arise from humans' creative engagement with their environment. So it's no surprise that they embody a wide range of human responses: prosaic, utilitarian, imaginative, evaluative, humorous, mocking. Furthermore, there is scarcely anything too small to be given a name, and these so-called microtoponyms can be found in sources from medieval boundary descriptions to modern colloquial languages. There's also a lively movement of place names across the globe, driven by a variety of motivations, both positive and negative. Now, all the above names types I'll be talking about in this lecture. Let me start with microtoponyms, a big word for the name of a small place, so small that such places often fall beneath the radar of even the detailed Ordnance Survey maps. However, they are really as important as mapped names when it comes to understanding a locality in terms of exploitation of resources, trades, recreation, and land ownership, as well as significant events, stories, and lore. They refer to such objects as fields, fishing spots, rocks, gullies, bogs, and climbing routes. They are usually used only by a small group of people, sometimes only by one family. Because of the relatively limited numbers using these names, often exclusively orally, another important aspect is their mutability or instability. This is especially true of field names, which can reflect an ever-changing pattern of land use and farming methods, and are often known only to those working the farm. In many of these, it is difficult to draw the line between a name and a description. They can also be contested. Alison Burns, while doing research for her 2015 Glasgow PhD, Field Names of North East Scotland, a socio-onomastic study, even experienced an argument within a family about a field name. However, there is one farm I know of whose field names are literally set in stone. This is the farm of Fawfield, or Fallfield, in Connacher Parish in East Fife. Here in the later 19th century, pillar stones were erected in every field with their name engraved on them. You can see on the map stones written over various fields, and these are some of the stones. And you can see the names Robertson's Field, West End Field, etc. So the whole farm, in the middle of each field, is one of these posts. So nobody can argue with them. The importance of microtoponyms to local history and identity has been recognised in Ireland by the creation of a crowdsourcing project called Mehaloginem. This describes itself as a community place name collection project, and it invites the public to enter Irish and English minor names into an online database. As it says, it's an opportunity for people to preserve and share the minor place names in their native area. Now, different user groups develop their own microtoponymic landscape as a tool for their activities. User groups such as hunters, anglers, golfers, and climbers. In this way, different names for the same feature can emerge. For example, maps of shooting estates will often use an Ordnance Survey as a base map on which the Gaelic toponymy has been completely overwritten by English names to make it easier for a largely non-Gaelic speaking clientele to record exactly where a kill was made. Yet the anglers also have their own names for all the little fishing places. This is Loch Leven. You can see Thrapple Hole, Hole of Inch, Gairneymouth, again to record it, to know exactly where the fish were being caught. Now, cliffs and rock faces in the hills at popular climbing spots have an intricate web of names for the different ascents. Those in Scotland were meticulously explored by Sheila Young in a 2016 article, The Eternal Ascent. The names are usually bestowed by a member of the first group to climb a particular ascent. There's certain protocols, however, for a name to be officially accepted, and one of which is that there should be no profanities. You can see a wee sample of them here without the profanities, and some of them were pretty profane. She had some examples in her article. So you can see names like Magical Mystery Tour, Steep Frowning Glories, Trail of Tears, says it all. By their very nature, microtoponyms are prone to disappearing entirely. It's therefore remarkable that we have a corpus of microtoponyms going back to the medieval period. These are the ones which appear in boundary descriptions and perambulations. A perambulation being a judicial procedure by which disputes about boundaries are settled. The boundary which is finally agreed upon is, or is being reasserted, is then described in minute detail using reference points such as stones and ditches, and many of these are named. There are literally hundreds of such texts, many preserved in monastic cartularies. They bring the medieval landscape alive, I think, in an unrivaled way. And also, how else would we know that rhubarb was growing in the southeast of Perthshire in the mid-14th century, unless one of the points on a disputed boundary between Strathord and Murthly had not been called the Lyn Rhubarbium, or Rhubarbium, the rhubarb pool or waterfall. Sometimes a microtoponym can have national resonance. One of the boundary markers of the lands of Kirkness in Kinrossshire is Growicus Well, the only place name, as far as I'm aware, that commemorates Queen Gruach, better known to the world as Lady Macbeth. King Macbeth and Queen Gruach had granted the lands of Kirkness to the monastery of nearby Loch Leven in the 11th century. These boundary texts also give us a unique insight into the linguistic situation on the ground, especially in those areas where Scots came to replace Gaelic. For example, in a 1253 perambulation of a large tract of land at Kingaldrum in Angus, in West Angus, we see Scots and Gaelic side by side, describing the same feature, one a translation of the other. You can see the Achach Meanach, the middle field, the Gaelic, and then they're actually translating it into Scots, Anglicae being, of course, the medieval Latin for Scots, what we would call Scots. And so it's all, so they're catering to a bilingual population, or even a population that lived in the same place but spoke different languages. You have to cover both bases. Now, Geoffrey Barrow, so often ahead of the game, recognised their importance to the extent that he published maps of 3 early perambulations in the Atlas of Scottish History, one of which was the Kingaldrum one. I think following one of these boundaries can be the nearest thing we get to walking through a medieval landscape. And I think, in my opinion, they're a much underused resource for the medievalist. Now, an element which occurs in names on medieval boundary charters is the Gaelic clach, a stone. The bigger the better, being an ideal boundary marker. In Lecture 4, I discussed certain clach names as referencing prehistoric or early historic monuments. However, clach more commonly refers to a conspicuous, naturally occurring stone, often an erratic block. Such stones are especially prone to attracting stories. Take, for example, Clach Ceann of Yar, the stone of the fingertip, a boundary stone near Newmore in Easter Ross. It was said that a boy's fingertip was cut off here to make sure he remembered where the boundary was. Clach names can also operate at the very opposite end of the scale from a microtoponym, playing an important role in the medieval Scottish social and political landscape. And one of the best known is Clach na Bretagne, the stone of the Britons in Glenfalach, marking the northernmost limit of the British kingdom of Al-Clwyd, later Dumbarton, and still near the boundary between the successor of that kingdom, the Lennox, to the south, and Perthshire, formerly in Pictland, to the north. And of course, probably the most famous is the Clach of Clackmannan, the stone of Manaw, the British kingdom that spanned the upper reaches of the Firth of Forth, as far south as Slamannan, the moor or upland of Manaw. The stone of Manaw was clearly a symbol of power and authority within that kingdom. I should point out, by the way, that the clach is the little boulder on the top of this dramatic standing stone. The plinth apparently was set up in 1833, partly to stop visitors from chipping off fragments of the original stone as relics. Now, the name Clackmannan was probably originally coined in the language of the kingdom of Manaw, namely Northern Brittonic, but the closer related word would be clog, which was very easy to adapt by later Gaelic speakers into clach. Now, in my introduction to this lecture, I mentioned place names embodying a wide range of creative responses to the environment. Amongst these were imaginative, evaluative, humorous. In many ways, the humorous response embraces both the imaginative and the evaluative. In the long 18th century, there is an explosion of humour in the Scottish place name stock. It's frequently pejorative, disparaging, even defiant. These names are mainly of small, marginal settlements and encapsulate the difficulties of eking out a living from poor, exposed ground. Many of them have not survived, their fate already prefigured in their names, while those which have survived have been given more positive names, part of a process known as gentrification or amelioration. For example, several contain the element hunger, either as a noun, such as hunger abade, hunger abode, or as a verb, as in the ubiquitous hunger him out, starve them out. As far as I'm aware, none of these has survived, with hunger him out by Kirkcaldy being renamed Hayfield after an 18th century provost of Kirkcaldy called Robert Hay. Another name redolent of hunger is tomb tuns, empty barrels. As I mentioned, the coining of this type of name belongs very much to the long 18th century, at a time of far-reaching changes in agricultural practices and displacement of the rural population. Many of the displaced ended up in the fast-growing cities, but others were pushed to the margins of habitable land. Weather conditions feature prominently. A settlement called Bad Weather says it all. It's in Shotts Parish, Lanarkshire, near the highest point on the Edinburgh-Glasgow road. Then there are literally scores of names containing Scots called, the many called hames, called cots. There's even a called brose and a field name called called breeks. Then we have wind at Windy Was, as well as Blaweary in Roxburghshire, a name which vividly encapsulates the essence of a place exposed to the wind. This is in contrast to several places called Blalawen, literally blow gently, either a positive name for a place sheltered from the wind, or, I think more likely, a request to the wind to blow more softly. In Northumberland, which shares so much with southern Scotland, in terms both of landscape and language, there is another Blaweary, a now ruined settlement. It lies at a height of almost 200 metres, 700 feet. And of course, the best known Blaweary is the fictional upland farm in the Mearns, where the Guthrie family eke out a living in Grassic Gibbon's novel Sunset Song, out of the world and into Blaweary. Then there are names which simply refer to the struggle to survive on poor land, names such as Scrape Hard and Stook Thin in Aberdeenshire. A notable feature of humorous names coined around this time is their syntax. Most of the names I've mentioned in these lectures consist of nouns and adjectives, sometimes with definite articles and prepositions. There are plenty of humorous names which conform to this general pattern. Tomb tuns, Windy Was. However, there's a large group of them which are verbal phrases, often combined with an adverb. Now, we've already seen this type in hunger him out, where hunger here is the transitive verb to starve. We've also got macamrach, you'll see that they make them rough, macamrach. On these maps, you can see the fate of macamrach in central Fife. Within 75 years, it had completely disappeared. There is another instance in Fife where macamrach has been upgraded to macamrich, which is probably why it has survived as the name of a plantation. The name Mount Hooley, which is found from Orkney in the north to Northumberland in the south, contains a command, or at least a recommendation, to climb or mount Hooley, which is carefully. Can it go up carefully? Sir Walter Scott was a great enthusiast for all these kinds of humorous names, creating or popularising such memorable ones as Deer Bocht and the ubiquitous Cleek 'em in, Cleek them in. Scott uses it as a name of a hostelry, punning the adverbial preposition in with the hostelry word in, double N. But Scott did not create this name, as our earliest record of one is on Roy's military map of around 1750. It's not entirely clear what was in the minds of the original name givers, but the primary meaning of to cleek, as I say, is to seize or catch or hook, So hook 'em in, which is a good name for a horse story. Now, many of these phrasal names are at the same time so widespread and so quirky that they cannot have been coined independently of each other. It may be they were originally Scots sayings or phrases that lent themselves to being applied to a place. One of my favourite types of humorous names are those using the Scots element ha, or northeast ha, hall. Both this and its English equivalent, hall, typically refer to some kind of large, high-status residence. And it's found, for example, in Newhall, near Crail, which first appears as early as the 1280s in a Latin translation, Nova Aula, New Hall. And there's also Abbot's Hall in Kirkcaldy, the residence of the Abbot of Dunfermline when visiting his lands there. However, in Scotland, and also to some extent in England from around 1700, it came to be used ironically of a lowly dwelling at the opposite end of the social scale. This usage is always signalled by a specific element which subverts the high status pretensions of a hall. Vegetable names are particularly effective in this regard: Cabbage Hall, Cybo Hall, Tatty Hall. Broadening out the foodstuffs, we have mutton halls, quite a few mutton halls, and then there are those for whom we are the foodstuffs, notably Midgie Hall in Kirkcudbrightshire. Vegetation is another favourite. We find Scroggy Hall. Last year I gave a talk on hall names in Scots at a Scottish Placing Society conference, in which I described scroggy as a Scots word meaning covered with wee busses and shelpit trees, covered in small bushes and small thin trees. Then, hardly surprising, we have Whinny Hall, a lot of Whinny Halls, characterised a wee farm or a croft characterised by whin or gorse. Bird specifics are also very popular. Carol Huff first brought attention to these bird hall names in two articles, which focus especially on Lark Hall or Laverock Hall and Gowk Hall. Bird hall names are common both in Northern England and in Scotland. In Scotland, our earliest examples are from the 18th century, while some of the English examples go back as far as around 1600. In Scotland, a range of species are represented: hoolits, chuchets, pyots, owls, lapwings, magpies. Gowk Hall, Cuckoo Hall, is especially common. Given that Scots gowk can also refer to a fool, it may be in this figurative sense that it was being used. This brings us to the more general question as to who exactly is coining these names. In most cases, it's likely that it is the inhabitants themselves, in the spirit of the self-deprecating humour I've mentioned. However, when it comes to implying that the inhabitants are gowks, then it's surely more likely we have a name which was coined by the wider community. We do in fact have a brief glimpse into the genesis of two related hall names, though this is far from typical. It's in a pair of names near West Calder in Midlothian, Shuttle Hall and Dander Hall. These belong to another group of hall names which relate to trades or occupations. It can be expressed directly through the persons themselves: Sooter Hall, a suitor being a cobbler, or Piper Hall. But more often it's expressed metonymically through objects connected with the trade, including tools, products, and byproducts. For example, we have a lot of thimble halls where tailors lived and worked. Also, dander halls, dander being fire refuse or cinders. So it refers to a smiddy by way of its main byproduct. And then there's shuttle hall, and there's no prizes for guessing, but that is where weavers have worked. Now, in West Calder, as I say, there's a dander hall and a shuttle hall right next to each other. For dander hall, the OS namebook from the mid-19th century has the following, I quote, "A row of cottages and a smithy on the estate of Hermond. This name was applied by Lord Hermond," and then in brackets the word dander being the Scots term for forge clinkers, close brackets, in allusion to the smithy, end of quote. While about the neighbouring Shuttle Hall, the namebook has, and I quote, "A row of cottages on the Hermond estate, chiefly occupied by labourers. The name was applied by Lord Hermond at a time when they were chiefly occupied by weavers," end of quote. So you'll have gathered in the course of these lectures that it's very rare to get only at the moment of name coining. Not only that, but the name of the coiner. But here we have, you see, it was the laird himself, using as a template other such hall names. The laird, by the way, was George Ferguson, a law lord who died in 1827. And then one of my favourite, which a lot of people have heard me talking about, I mentioned the process of gentrification or amelioration of these deprecating names. This is in East Fife, where we have the name Lousy Haw, 1775. Well, about 50 years later, it had been gentrified to Louisa Hall. So if you cast your mind back to the first lecture, I mentioned the first person to give the Rhind Lectures on place names, Sir Herbert Maxwell, in 1893. One of the many subjects he touched upon was the influence of railways on the pronunciation of place names, which you've already heard about twice, actually. I love it. Observing that porters were altering the stress pattern of station names as they shouted them out when a train arrived. But we have an example from a Fife where the railway goes beyond pronunciation. The influence of the railway goes beyond pronunciation. Ladybank, a station and junction, the edge of the How of Fife, was originally Lady Bog. And like so many lady names in Scotland, the lady in question is Our Lady, Mother of Christ. This name went back to the time when the extensive marshlands along the River Eden were owned and exploited by Lindores Abbey, one of whose patron saints was Our Lady. The new railway proprietors considered Lady Bog a bit coarse, so they changed it to Lady Bank. The saint remained, but the bog went. The humorous impulse in modern times tends to confine itself to house names, also a type of microtoponym. For example, we have puns, such as the tired cliche Dunroman, or another type are names spelt backwards. For example, we've got Crodra, which is hard work backwards. So if you're confronted with a really baffling house name, it's always worth reversing the order of the letters. There's the exotic sounding house name Emmaroo, which is Urheim backwards. And Emmaroo in Aberdeenshire has actually made it onto the Ordnance Survey map. Another great opportunity for toponymic humour are nicknames, usually pejorative. Probably the best known in Scotland is Auld Reekie, Old Smoky for Edinburgh, and it was so named for the same reason as London was called simply the Smoke. Now, these are not, of course, straightforward equivalents to the standard name, but belong to a quite different register. And they're not all pejorative. Just think of the Big Apple for New York. Nicknames can also be abbreviated forms of the full name. For example, in the Northeast especially, there was a strong tendency to abbreviate farm names, usually with the diminutive ending "e." A further twist to such nicknames was that they became the local nickname for the farmer himself. For example, my old friend Christine Knight, who grew up on a farm in Aberdeenshire, tells me that a neighbouring farm of Brown Hill was locally known as Brunny, which was also how the farmer was referred to. While the humour in the above examples is intentional, there are also names in which the humour is completely unintentional. A name usually coined hundreds of years ago, often in a language no longer spoken in the area, can by pure chance end up looking like a word in current language. And if the word is quirky enough, the name takes on a dynamic of its own. I'm thinking of names like Lost in Aberdeenshire or Dull in Perthshire, much beloved of postcard makers and joke books. They can also be cleverly exploited by the local community. Dull has officially twinned itself with Boring in the USA and more recently Blandshire in Australia. This has boosted visitor numbers to the area hugely, the economic benefits being enjoyed mainly by the local town of Aberfeldy. Economic impact, place names. The interesting stuff, by the way, on the signpost includes a weathered early medieval cross slab and a parish kirk dedicated to St. Adamnan. This is just one example of several afterlives that a place name can have. I talked in the first lecture about Ginhenechus. Remember how place names, through reinterpretation, can become prompts and repositories for stories. They can also be repurposed as a shorthand for social class and pretensions, if you think of Morningside in Edinburgh, and in Edinburgh context. And I should add, by the way, for anybody from Morningside, that such names can retain their associative force even when the social makeup of the place has changed. Often a name can just sound funny or exotic to a particular language community. This can be semantic, as we've seen in dull, but it can also be simply to do with sound. And this is exploited in many poems. An example would be a poem called Tip Topography, read out in 1903 by a Mr. R.J. Muir to the Edinburgh Angus Club. It's 14 verses. I'll just read 2 to give you a flavour. There's mill of Inverarity, the water of Pitcarity, and then there's a Nahwarity, Terfachi and Terfbeg, cross the country from Pitcairly to the bonny house at Airlie, by the Ogle and Shackshoggle to Glenprosen's Craigie Meg. Sing the Mansion o' Kinblethment and the Moorland o' Montrethment, Aberlemno and Rumkemno, Horny Hawk and Rashi Bog, there's Cleekham and Cleekham, and the Mains of Fleekham, Rethwally and Glencolly, and the Hills of Cat and Dog. So this was read to a local audience. This would also have an added layer of associative resonance and humour. Now, there's a Scottish poem which uses the humorous onomatopoeia, the structure, and both the unintentional and intentional semantics of place names to make serious and controversial social comment. This is Edwin Morgan's Canadolia, an off-concrete Scotch fantasia. In a Scottish Place Name Society newsletter, the poet Anna Crowe wrote an insightful analysis of this poem. On the surface, it seems to be simply a playful romp through what to our ears are the weird and wonderful sounds of Scottish place names. For example, we've got Rúsaw rum, Garvsaw smoo, Nigsaw tain, Lairgsaw lag, etc. However, as Crowe points out, there's a lot more going on under this playful surface. Written in 1963, it is in fact a celebration of homosexuality at a time when in Scotland there was little to celebrate and many reasons to conceal. The poem is constructed as a series of questions answered by a litany of place names acting as exclamations, nouns, verbs and adjectives. For example, what was it like there? Oh, it's fruchy, it's faithfully, it's wamfrey, it's frandy, it's slidery. Then there's certain sexual innuendo in the poem. What did you do there? Are we foundle and fungal, we bonkle and meagle and max poffle? But this remains non-gendered. However, Morgan breaks cover with the next question. What's the best in the country? It's blink bonny, air gold, thunder gay. And followed by the disapproving, and what's the worst? Scrishvin, Shiskin, Scrabster, and Snizert. The last verse is crazy. Here, Morgan creates new couplings of familiar place names from throughout Scotland. It consists of about 20 names in which the generic and specific elements are all swapped around. Let me give you an example. Question, but who was there? Peter Moidert and Craigan Kenneth and Cambus Puttock and Eccles Machty and Corrie Hoolish and Balladolly and Altnacani and Clachnavrechen, ending up with Inchtamurchen and Ochterfechen and Kinloch Cooter and Arna Whalley and Invershugel. As Crowe writes, all the names have been allowed to indulge in linguistic promiscuity and swap their usual partners for others. What is interesting is how natural these new couples sound, as though the land of Canadolia had space enough for all. And note also, the list starts with Peter Moidert and Craigan Kenneth. Then comes the final affirmation of this reconfigured Scotland, as the last question Morgan asked, and what was the toast? Schahalian, 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 which, for those in the know, means the fairy hill of the Caledonians. So through place name stories, through the dull and boring phenomenon, through poetry, we've been tracking place names as they move further and further away from their roots in human interaction with their environment and as ways of negotiating the environment. Probably the ultimate alienation of place names from these roots, one might call it almost a kidnapping or name-napping, is to be found in a wee book which appeared in 1983 called The Meaning of Lif by Douglas Adams and John Lloyd. It's bold, and in my opinion, of course, deeply flawed, premise is that place names are just lying around the landscape doing nothing, so they should be repurposed as words for things we have no words for. The names are from all over the world, but here are some Scottish ones, just to give you a flavour. Cromarty, the brittle sludge which clings to the top of ketchup bottles and plastic tomatoes in nasty cafes. Sconser, a person who looks around them when talking to you to see if there's anyone more interesting about. And funerary, the safe place you put something and forgot where it was. Now, a very different kind of deracination of a place name is in the realm of transferred names. We're more used to these in a colonial setting, with names transferred from the home country to what Europeans call the New World. They are legion. In fact, you could pick almost any village and town name in Scotland and find its offspring in North America or the Antipodes. Some have thrived so well in their new environment that they've come to completely overshadow their parent. Dallas would be a good example. The motivations for these transfers range from the purely sentimental to the highly political. However, there's movement in the opposite direction, not only from the New World, but from almost every corner of the globe. A very frequent motivation is the celebration of victory. Think how many places, be these settlements, inns, or plantations called Trafalgar, or Trafalgar, as many were formerly pronounced, reflecting the original stress pattern. A Trafalgar name can commemorate a veteran of the battle, or the time when the news arrived of when it was headline news, when people heard about the victory. Features with the names of lesser-known battles are much more likely to commemorate members of the landholder's family who had fought in the eponymous battle. For example, we have Dettingen Mount near Cumnock on the lands of Dumfries House in Ayrshire, commemorating an Earl of Dumfries' role in achieving victory at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany in 1743. In fact, the names of most of the overseas battles won by British armies and navies in the last 300 years can be found somewhere or other in the Scottish namescape. I apologise for the slide. Biblical names. A very particular type of transferred name are those from the Bible. They're almost all from the Old Testament, and most of them reflect the intense engagement with that text in the 17th and 18th century, above all by the Presbyterian population, although we know that some were being coined as late as the 19th century. The relatively high number of names is striking. Striking also is the fact that, apart from those who have closely studied the Old Testament, be it for religious or scholarly purposes, few people in modern Western society will know their backstories or associations. Who would know the association of Dothan, Ramoth Gilead, Zoar, Goshen, Padanaram, for example? Others, however, still resonate, such as Babylon, Gomorrah, Lebanon, Sodom, Jericho. Now, not all of these resonate positively, of course. Sodom is an obvious one. It usually occurs where there are early coal or lime workings, anything that produces smoke and flames. Two of these Sodoms are close to Gomorrahs, and near one pairing is the coal mining area of West Fife. Now, the fire theme is taken up more positively in the nearby farm of Dothan, which is where Elisha was protected from being seized by the king of Syria by horses and chariots of fire. Such associative naming shows just how well acquainted with the Old Testament the name givers were. Now, while my industrial and smoke-filled explanation for the various Sodoms and Gomorrahs remains valid, there are exceptions. For example, we're told in the OS Namebook of 1878 that Sodom on Halsey Island in Shetland is, I quote, a fancy name given by the late proprietor of Walsey who disliked the tenant there. Now, before bringing these lectures to an end, I'd like to look at the most important name of the weekend, and that is Rhind. It derives from the parish and settlement name Rhind on the Tay, south of Perth. As it stands, it is the Gaelic word rin, Old Gaelic rind, meaning a point or a promontory, which would seem to refer to this remarkable tongue of land at the confluence of the Erne and the Tay, which you can clearly see in this map. At the very tip of this tongue was the medieval parish kirk of Rhind. However, as with many place names, it's not quite what it seems. If you go back to the early forms, you'll see Rhindelgros, actually 2 or 3 times, and then 50 years later, the Rhind, and then it is Rhind or Rhind all the way through. Now, the extra bit of the name is the Gaelic Gelagros, containing Gaelic gelig, a thorn, and Ross, a promontory. Now, W.J. Watson translates it as prickle point, adding either from its shape or from prickly shrubs growing on it. I would say it's almost definitely the former, the thorn underlying its long, thin shape. Now, it might seem that Gelagros and Rhin refer to the same feature, but I suspect that the Rhin refers to the very tip of this promontory where the medieval church stood, while Gelagros was the name of the whole promontory. So it might be rendered point of Gelgros. Other explanations are available, but that will do for now. And it had become simply Rhind, as you see, by the 13th century, and then much later Rhind. Now, it's a nice coincidence that the story you heard at the start of the first lecture concerned Macduff, if you can cast your mind back, Macduff crossing the Erne with his loaf of bread. And this story may well have been located at Rhind. And the ferryman who he gave the loaf of bread to instead of money, and who took him across the Erne, was the ancestor of Aitken in Aitken's boat, of course being a ferry. Or, who knows, it might have been an ancestor of Rhind himself. Now, I hope in the course of these lectures I've managed to convey something of the multifaceted, complex and fascinating world, or even worlds, of place names without totally confusing you. And to answer that question that came in after lecture 1, as to what my favourite place name is, there are far too many. I think I love them all. So I'm afraid I'm just going to have to say Schiehallion. So it just remains for me to thank the Society very much for the honour of being the 146th Rhind lecture, and also to thank you all very much for coming along and tuning in, and special thanks to those who've stayed the course. Thank you very much.